Booyah! All right, we're ready. So I don't know if anybody else is joining us, but all right, where are we? Hurdle tutorial. Cynthia.
I got an error on 12.3.
12.3.
Okay.
Did you keep going, or that?
I kept going, so I'm pretty much at the end. I just need a review.
Okay. I think that's pretty much exactly the same for me, although I think my error is somehow related to something earlier, but anyway.
I'm done.
Done?
Yeah. I'm on 12, just starting 12.
Just starting 12. Cool.
Good work, everyone.
That's one day I was like, what are these fingers here?
On my iPad.
I see. Okay. Jorge, where are you at in your tutorial?
12.2.
Okay, sounds good. So I think we're probably just going to jump into it today. So just in case I forget to say it later, so the plan is definitely, so today is the last regular class we're going to have like this, and the plan is that we will we'll be meeting the same time next week, so Thursday 6:30 to talk about projects. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Okay, sounds good. All right, who has questions? Now we're on chapter 12. Could be on any chapter in the whole thing. No questions? I have lots of questions. So actually, I don't have many questions. I just have some fundamental misunderstandings that I need to work through. Hey, what?
I said you failed. You don't have many questions.
Well, I think of them as few questions, but they may be lengthy.
Right.
All right, nobody else. All right, you guys just make sure you let me know when you want your turn to ask a question. I'm hoping that my first question will look fairly simple, but will be helpful, I hope. So I'm going to try to share my screen because I'm going to have to move back and forth through quite a few different parts of our app files. Okay, that's Isabel. We've not yet identified errors with her. Okay, so my first question is, if you look at listing 12.32, this is where we are setting up the create and destroy actions in the relationships controller, basically so that we can have a working follow and unfollow button, right? So where's my, as I say that, I'm talking about it, but I don't have that pulled up. Well, I guess I don't actually really need to look at it myself. So my question is, okay, so we've basically done it. It looks very simple, especially the way that he first does it. He adds a little complexity when we add Ajax to it later on, but it only looks super simple because we've already done all the hard work basically coming up to this point. So if we look at this file, how do I, is that, no, that's not doing it. that does make some difference. Hold on. Is that big enough?
I can see it.
Yeah, Cynthia, is that okay?
I have bad eyesight, but that's okay.
Jared, how to make it bigger? Do you know?
Control Command plus, maybe.
Okay, so I thought it would be helpful just to walk through. I feel like after spending quite a bit of time looking at it, I was able to walk through and have a better understanding of how these create and destroy methods are working. But it took quite a bit of time, and I still had some questions as I went through it. So I guess I'll just go through and tell you guys what confused me and see if you guys have answers or say, oh no, that's not confusing at all. So we want to create, so this create method here, we want to create here what we're creating is the relationship, right? One user is following another user. So we start off by defining, and this is one of the first. If you're looking at this in the actual tutorial at listing 12.32, it's not at user, it's user. But that's one thing that I have a question about is, so that changes. We have to change that when we start using Ajax, which I don't claim to understand. So that'll be one of my questions. Is there a short answer to that, Jared? Do you know? We can come back to it if you don't immediately know the answer or if it's not a short answer.
Yeah, I would have to check really fast. Did you say you have to change that when you start using Ajax? Did you make a mention of that?
Yeah.
Okay, we can follow up with Ajax. Like I said.
Okay, well, we can come back to that because so even without worrying about whether that's like an instance variable with at user, my first question was, okay, so we're setting a user equal to, and then user.find and searching for a user using params followed underscore ID. And did this seem odd to anybody else, or is it just me? I'll tell you why it seemed odd to me is because my first thought was, wait, how can we be searching for the user that's going to be followed by followed underscore ID if we haven't in the method that's supposed to create that relationship? Doesn't that seem kind of circular? That was my logic, or like why it seemed very odd to me was we're looking for the followed user by followed underscore ID at a point when we're just about to create the following relationship. And so then that got me thinking, okay, so where did we give it this followed underscore ID? Do you guys already know? Does anybody know off the top of their head?
I'm looking for it.
You're looking for it? Do you guys know? Mm-hmm. So I think we did it, if you look at this partial right here, the underscore follow.html.erb, this is the form, I guess we call it a form, although it's an odd sort of form to me, that we used to say to basically create the button on the screen when you're on somebody's user page, it's the button that you see at the top of the screen that allows you to follow them. It's the follow button. And so if I understand correctly, and this is where I kind of had to just walk through this. And again, maybe it wasn't confusing to other people, but we basically went ahead and we said here, in order to upon clicking that button, we had to submit some information, and the only way to do it, since it's just a button, was to use this hidden field tag. And so we went ahead, and Jared, does this sound right to you? This where it says hidden field tag and has the symbol followed _ID, comma, @ user ID. I assume that's saying we're assigning the user ID. We're going to say that's the followed _ID.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's no different than any of the other forms that we've submitted, where what it's doing, does it show the generated HTML? I don't know if it does, but it's no different than any of the other forms that we've created, where all you're doing with this followed ID portion is giving it the name for the attribute, using a symbol to say, here's what this is going to look like in the params object that we get back. And then the @user.id is just setting the value for that param. So when you get that, when it sends something back to the server, it's going to have this followed ID parameter, and the value is going to be the value of the user ID having been evaluated, right? Not @user ID, but the actual value for that user's ID, right?
Yeah. So that makes sense to me. Although it was still a little before going and looking at that, it was a little confusing to me how we had already identified a followed ID before we'd created the relationship. But I guess so it makes sense that we're kind of putting a name on it before we create the relationship. So then I was like, okay, well, now I understand what's going on in the first line, more or less. So I went to the second line, and current user dot follow, current user is taking the dot follow method, I guess, and it's being passed @user. And at first glance, this one sort of made a lot of sense, but then if I really thought, wait, could I have written this myself? It didn't make as much sense. I mean, I was like, wait, so where did we define current _user again? It's one of those things that it's so, like, because it's just called current user, it almost just, you don't even really think about it. But it took me, I eventually had to go in and use the handy dandy find in files method to find where we defined current _user. And after I did that, it did make sense, because we defined it back in the sessions controller.
The sessions helper.
Sessions helper, yeah. Because the sessions helper actually ends up doing quite a bit of work here for us. So basically, if you look to the sessions helper, which I think I do actually have open here. Yeah, essentially we go through this process in defining the current user. We go through the process of seeing if somebody's logged in, and if somebody is logged in, the current user just is the user who is logged in, right?
Right.
So that made sense. And then I guess my next just basic Rails question was one that kind of gets me confused over and over again is, so current user is defined in the sessions helper, and then we're calling the follow method, which is defined in the user model,
Mm-hmm.
which is also like a huge kind of workhorse file for us. Like it's doing a lot of stuff. I do have two of those. Oops. And so I guess one of my basic questions was just, wait, how does that work again? When can we call which methods do we have access to? Because now, so we're in, just to remind myself, so we're currently, the main file we're talking about here is the relationships controller.
Right.
So, maybe does anyone besides Jared know which things we can refer to in the relationships controller? I don't know the answer. I'm just wondering. No. I know on at least one occasion we had to go back and put something in the application controller because I think that was the log in method, because we wanted to be able to reference it elsewhere.
Do you know the answer to this?
No.
No? Yeah, if you look at your applications controller, which remember everything else is inheriting from, the applications controller is including your sessions helper in it. And so he's sort of been just shoving these sort of global things that don't really attach to a controller directly into this sessions helper in general as a place to put them. It's arguable that some of those could have gone instead into the application controller, although they're not really necessarily controller bits. They are sort of helper assistant functions. But
so wait, and that's Rails magic that the sessions helper is what, or did we specifically say everything in the sessions helper should be accessible via the application controller?
Yeah, we explicitly added it in. If you look at your actual application controller file, I've got it up if you want to look at my screen or whatever.
Oh.
Oh yeah, the include session helper.
In our applications controller, we're including our session helper. And so by doing that, everything that inherits from the applications controller is going to have everything that's on the session helper on them.
Yep.
So that's how essentially that's the way that you're able to call current user everywhere without having to worry about it.
Right.
We also have, we've also got other helpers that we've created. For example, we have the user helper that we created. It doesn't have a lot in it. We have Gravatar 4, so that we can go get a Gravatar. Do we have anything in any of these other ones? You probably didn't. I think they're created by default.
Yeah.
So if we did something like look for this across our code, oops, Gravatar 4, we're going to see that unlike the stuff coming from the sessions helper, Gravatar 4 is only going to be used in things that are getting the user's controller directly in some way, like it's defining the user's helper, the user.html.erb.
Right. So what about it feels more like fundamental, but what about the follow method that is defined in the user model?
What about the follow method?
Yeah. Well, how come we can access follow and unfollow?
It's because those are methods on a user, and the sessions controller, the current user method from the sessions controller, is going to return a user. And since it returns a user, then you have access off of that user to any methods that are on a user
Oh, okay.
self. So that would mean, and I don't have the follow or whatever in my code, but you would have access to anything that's a method on your user because what you passed was a user. So all of the methods you can call off of it. You know, you wouldn't be able to call them just follow without the user because you don't have that object. Right. But those methods sort of travel with the object anywhere it goes. So when you pass a user object or you have a user object, you have all the methods off of him that you can use.
Okay. That makes sense. Does anybody else have questions about that? No. So the next level of my confusion was okay, so we're the follow method is seems pretty straightforward. So the follow method is like a verb that we've defined in the user in our user.rb model file, and it's what actually creates the relationship, right? So that is, right. I don't know why I'm so bad at sharing my screen. Why is it not working? Oh, that's why, because I'm clicking on these shared screen, not the, there it goes. So it's defined as, this is where I get, again, a bit confused. So it's defined, it's a method that takes the variable other underscore user and then active underscore relationships that creates the actual relationship, taking the followed underscore ID, taking the other user ID variable that has just been passed and making it the followed ID, which again, so I guess there's a couple of things. One, this gets back to a question I had last time that Ramiro explained, where one of the IDs here is coming directly from, even though it's not referenced anywhere in this method, one is coming from the fact that the create method itself uses the user's ID as its default foreign key, right? Is that correct to call it its foreign key, or just that it?
Yeah, I mean you can.
It is a foreign key. But
it uses it.
It references it.
Yeah, it uses it as the follower ID.
Yeah.
Usually when you're referring to something as a foreign key, I mean you can call it a foreign key, yeah. But usually when you're referring to it that way, it's more just a way to say this key maps as a key, this column, this value is a key in another table. And that way you can do a reference to another table.
Right.
So it's not really necessarily mapping to another table per se. Right. You know, it's just getting another value. Right. At that point in time.
So what was really confusing to me then is, so then we call the other ID that's being passed in, we call that variable the other underscore user ID, which makes sense. Like, I mean, I think that was a good name for it. It's the other user, the user you're going to follow. And then we set other underscore user to followed underscore ID, thereby creating the relationship in the database And this is the point, because it's the create method, this is where it's actually saved in the database, right?
Right.
But one of the, this is kind of a silly thing, but to me it's really confusing. The confusing part is that we've already been calling that the followed underscore ID that particular number, right? And then we go back and then temporarily when we're talking about passing it to this function, we're calling it other underscore user, and then assigning it again, then again saying this is called the followed underscore ID. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
we basically, if I understand correctly, what we're doing is, I don't know if it's correct to think of it as we've called it follow underscore ID in memory already, but now we're calling it followed underscore ID in the database. I don't know if that's correct or not, but one way or the other, we've clearly started calling it followed underscore ID. Now this is like the third time we've identified it, in my mind, that we've identified it as followed underscore ID.
Yeah.
We've like gone back and forth.
It is, yeah. We're going. Well, what's happened is what we sent to the browser in the form, right, was just the ID,
right,
for the person that you're going to be following. I could look it up, but so you send over just the ID, the user.id, and that's because the browser can't really support Ruby objects, right? I'm sure people have methods to do that, but it's not very, it can't natively process Ruby objects, and that would be a whole bunch of data that you don't need to send. So instead we just send the one little ID. And then when somebody clicks follow in the browser, it's going to map to the relationships controller. And in the relationships controller, is that me highlighting? Must be him. In the relationships controller, it's going to, for the create, it's then going to take this ID that we sent. We knew who the user was, and we set the ID for the form, but all we got back was an ID. It doesn't know the user anymore, right? Because the browser just sent, here's an ID, right, to the relationships controller to follow. So then the relationships controller has to find a user that matches that ID again. Now some people may not necessarily go through that step. They may, for example, skip the find and you could just pass that ID directly into current user.follow. I don't know if that would work because this follow is what we wrote. It's the active relationship follow that needs the ID, but you could do that, but by making sure that there's an actual user when you try and create it again on the back end, it's yet another verification process that somebody didn't submit some invalid ID or something else. So you map it again back to a user, get a user out of your database that matches the ID. Then we're going to call down into the current user.follow method, giving him the user object. And then in there, we're again going to pull out just the ID and assign it to a followed ID parameter that we send into the active relationships create method.
Right.
So you can reuse those variable names as long as they're not in the same scope. You can always use the same variable name. So in that case, the only scope for that followed ID in the user.follow method is for the active relationships create method. It doesn't exist outside of there. So there's no conflict with the followed ID scope here in our relationships controller create method or anywhere else. And sometimes that's very useful because it helps you see that it's related. It's the same, oh, this is probably the same piece of information. We named it similarly.
Right.
And sometimes you might name them a little bit differently because you care about the context or what's going on with them.
Yeah, because at the same time, it just reinforces this, well, wait a minute, why? I mean, when I was thinking about, this was not one where I sat down and tried to do the tough task of actually writing it myself without looking at what he'd written.
Right.
But thinking about it afterwards, I was like, geez, I definitely I would have thought that I could have done something like def create, and then, I mean, certainly having looked at the beginning of his, I would have thought, wait a minute, we know what the followed user is from the very beginning. It's the user on whose page we're on at the moment we click a button. And so then my whole thought process would just be, okay, how do we say that? How do we identify this as the user whose page we're on? And the most obvious answer, I guess, is now having seen how we set up that button is, oh, we're already passing something via the browser that is the followed underscore ID. So I guess I would have tried to short circuit that step if I were doing this.
There's a lot of ways to have done that too. He chose that route. You could have, for example, when you're on that user's page, you have I don't know how this is structured, right? I'll have to go through and look, but you should have the URL should contain that user's name or ID or something along those lines in it. And those are going to be parameters as well that you could read when you get a response, and you could pull out that portion of it and try and map back to a user that way as well. So you could potentially have just used that as your way to get that information.
Right.
You may have gone this route. This is me just not knowing what Rails does, some of the other stuff. You may have gone this route also because of using the form and then wanting to use AJAX approaches for the data. It might work better so that it could be more flexible and not needing to pass all the URL information back. But, right. Plus, he's pretty consistent on what he uses to identify people. I don't think we're showing the ID for a user on their page. No. So in their URL or anything. So if that's the case, it makes sense that he'd be consistent with this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So for now, I want to skip the rest. So the rest of the code in the first version that he writes, he doesn't have this next block, the respond to block, which is just he adds once he switches to using AJAX. Before it just sends us back to routes us back to the to the home page or the users. Basically, just says where we should go next, which is I guess what AJAX is doing as well, but allowing us to stay on the same page. So then looking at so we've got the destroy method up there too. I don't know what you guys said. Do you guys think that the destroy method is, I can also pull that up too. Did you guys think that the destroy method made more sense, less sense? I kind of thought when personally looking at them, but both of them seemed very, very straightforward at a glance. But then when I really started to try to trace what we were doing, it got a lot less straightforward.
Right. There's a lot. I mean, by the time you've built up to this point in the application, there's a lot of Rails magic going on. Yeah. Probably one of the hardest ones to understand is exactly what you were doing with last class. The fact that you have these active relationships, property object on your user, and then figuring out how does it get the ID of the user and some of the other stuff. That's a lot of the Rails magic going on under the covers that's connecting those pieces. Right. Yeah, and that all depends how much of a challenge that's going to be for you. Just depends on the way you try and look at the code. I tend to more like you. I'm like, man, I don't understand where this is coming from. I'm trying to piece together all of the little bits that should be going into something. Right. So I'm going to get hung up on a lot of the same pieces. Some people will fly through that and not worry about that until they need to deal with something about that, and just accept that the framework's doing that portion of code for them.
Right. Yeah. Did you guys Well, do you guys want to go through the destroy side of it too? It is a little. There's some other stuff that comes up on the destroy side.
Just the first line.
Yeah.
Yeah. The relationship dot find with params ID.
I guess that's going to the database and finding the one of the IDs for the user that we follow, right? In a sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then once we clicked on follow, then it'll bring us back to our user.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting to me that we find, so now that we're in the process of destroying this relationship. Yeah, now we're still doing a search to find something in the database first, but we're doing it first on the relationship itself, right?
Yeah. See now that I see it, I think I would have. Oh, I haven't read up to that point, but when my thinking of like on following user would have been like again like user equals like using the instance variable at user and then somehow on follow the user like that, but
right. Yeah, I would have been.
guess,
I think I would have been tempted to skip the step of searching by the relationship and try to just somehow search on the user itself that we wanted to.
Yeah, because that relationship, it is going to our database. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then so we're calling the followed method on that relationship in order to give us the followed ID, right? And which I tried to figure out how that worked, and to me, the only thing I can figure out is I'll share my screen again.
This one's just a little trickier with the way trying to. All right.
To me, it looked like using the followed method to get the followed ID is available only because of the has many relationships established at the top of the user.rb file, I think.
What was that again?
I think we can only call that, from what I can tell, we can only call the followed method here, and so we're in the destroy method. We can only call this followed method on a certain relationship which we found using the ID for that relationship that was established. The only place I could find that seemed to allow that was going back up to here to the has many.
Has many I think he doesn't do a great job of explaining this one. I was just looking for I think this is the only reference. When he's showing us building this active relationships table, he tends to be showing it with the follower ID and the followed ID in the table, right?
Yeah.
But this here is what the table actually looks like with everything that we create in it, right? We add these created at, updated at values, but the important part here is it has an ID.
Yeah.
That's going to be unique for each relationship, right?
Right.
So if you're thinking about how could you identify, if you're thinking about this table and you're going, how could somebody unfollow somebody else? How are they going to make a change to this table to unfollow? If we have, like, I'll just throw something up on my screen. What's the Notepad application on Mac?
Just call it notes.
Yeah, notes.
Is it notes? Works for me. That's not right. I thought that was like a
You make a new note, something else. Yeah.
I guess I can just do it inside of the editor too. Just create a new file. So if you had a database, like let's imagine we've got a few entries in there right now, and the first one has an ID of 1, and then for its user 1, let's give it users that are going to be much bigger, right? It's user 101. That way we won't confuse any of this. And he's now following user 42. And then we have each one of these, we're just going to go up for our increment. We also have user 42, who happens to be following user 101.
Right.
And we have user 101 who's following user 6, etc. If you have a table like this and you're trying to delete one entry in it, to delete one relationship, the first one, the create, is easier because we're creating a relationship. So all you need for that is the user who wants to follow someone and the person they want to follow. But with this table, and you want to delete a relationship per se, you can't just go off of those two pieces of information very easily, because you have to, well, first off, you need both of those, but the most unique piece of information in the table is the ID for each item. So if you only want to have one piece of information that you have to pass around when you're working with it, then if you can just pass around the ID, you'll have everything that you need to be able to reference a row in the table. And that's actually, we can jump back down here. I believe that's actually what he's referencing here. So if we go back up again to where he's setting these little template bits, here we go. In our form here, I can make this bigger too. What we're actually getting for the form and setting as the form's ID is we're getting, all right, for the current user, go to the active relationships of him and find the followed ID user followed by user.id entry.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going in there and we're getting this ID entry from our table and setting that in our form, so that when we, I might be slightly off on this, but I'm pretty sure it's very close to this. So then when we go to actually find it, okay, we go to the relationship table again, and we want to find by something with only one piece of information. Well, the ID of that entry that we set for our form is all we need.
Right.
And then relationship will have, it's got follow, follower, and followed, or whatever.
Right.
So we just get the followed property off that relationship.
Right.
And that's our user ID, I believe, not our actual user, although it might be the actual user.
Well, in this sense, user there is as a variable is just, we could have called that anything, right? In this particular instance, couldn't we have called that Bob, set Bob equal to that, and then passed Bob to current underscore user dot unfollow with Bob? So,
yeah. I can't even spell, it doesn't matter, I'm there. Yeah, okay, but it is actually, because this is part of that Rails magic, right? Is Rails knows all these relationships of the different items, and so that is a method, you're right, of followed, where it's going and getting the actual followed user. Right, it does this.
Yeah.
essentially it's a method that goes and fetches up the followed user from Rails from the database.
Right, and so I think all that part that you just explained is actually the more fundamental part, like the thing that we should all understand. But then even after all that, yeah, part of what confused me was, wait a minute, where does followed? It makes sense that there'd be a method that's called followed, but where did we actually define a method called followed? And we didn't.
No, I think that's the exact same question you were asking.
Yeah, this is where it gets back to if you go
I think you're right.
back to the only place where I think we essentially did is up here in I'm actually not sure which of these two lines is what truly allows it, or if they're both necessary for this. But it's one of those two. Well, when I say two, I mean one of these two has many statements.
Yep. Yeah, it's when you set up that relationship.
Actually, I guess it's probably the second one. I'm still a little, I have to remember source followed. Would that have created a followed method?
That's what I'm thinking.
I don't know. Anyway, I don't think we should get too hung up on that, but that did confuse me. I was like, well, wait, it's sort of, I would have guessed that there would have been some sort of method like that, but I don't know where we created it, and it would have just been, if I was writing it from scratch, I would have been kind of just hoping I got it right. Yeah, but so at that point we have, we basically have both pieces of information we need so Jared had just showed the unfollow. Let me show that again. So that for the unfollow method,
I think that piece that you're looking at actually right now actually comes from this listing 12.3 where it's doing the relationship one. And it's saying that a relationship has a followed and it's the user. So
yeah.
setting up the relationships for highlighting this. Nice.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that's where it's setting it up.
Gotcha.
Because it's not actually, I think it's not actually pulling it from the user. It's pulling it from, this is the followed property of a relationship, and it's saying, oh, the followed property of relationship is the user that maps to the ID for it.
Right.
Following ID or whatever. So.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and then we, looking back at the, at the destroy method that we were talking about. So we use the relationship ID to have a unique way of referencing this relationship, but in the end, we go back in order because of how we've defined the unfollow. The unfollow method. The unfollow method is not, you don't destroy a relationship by just passing it its ID. You destroy it by passing it the user and the other user again.
Right.
Right. So we now, but anyway, in any case, so we now have both of those pieces of information that we needed for the unfollow method as defined here in the user.rb, and that relationship is then destroyed, deleted from the database. Right.
Yep. And one of the reasons you're going to write it that way, instead of passing the ID as well for these types of things, is the user cares about another user directly and following or unfollowing another user. They don't really care about an ID value. I mean, I know it's what you end up using, but by, in a sense, by passing around the user, you're passing around the piece of information that logically makes sense,
Yeah.
as opposed to somebody looking at the function and not being able to understand why is there an ID here?
Yeah.
Takes a little more thought process as to why that would be the parameter that you pass in the first place.
Right.
So even though it requires a little more work sometimes, you're redoing the same work in a few different places. If you make your code easier to read and understand, that's critically important.
Should I go to my next question, or does anyone else have other questions? My next question jumps to his whole introduction of Ajax, and I just thought it would be good to hear someone else explain it a little bit. So it's section 12.2.5.
Mm-hmm.
I'll switch to Jared to your screen there. So as in my shorthand version of what he says is he basically explains that Ajax allows us to send information to the server without leaving the page. Does that sound right? Without, I don't know. Yeah, that's the best that I could do, because we want to be able to send. Actually, I'm not totally. I wasn't totally clear why. So he uses Ajax. I mean, that's kind of what he says. Hey, we'll use Ajax because we're unnecessarily, in the first version of the code we're unnecessarily sending, after you follow somebody, we're then sending you back to your home page rather than keeping you. Shouldn't we just keep you? There was a reason you were on their user page in the first place, and maybe it wasn't just to follow them. Shouldn't we just keep you there? It makes it sound like you couldn't do that without using Ajax.
Right. Well, I think what he's saying is, I think in the first version, it wasn't sending you back to the home page, right? It was sending you back to the exact same page. So after you followed someone, it would, let me check, simply redirect back to the original profile. So essentially, after you followed someone in the original version, I think it's just then, redirect to user. Yep.
Right, to your profile page.
To the profile page of the person you were just on, I believe. Because if we're looking at the create relationship here, the user that we have is the person whose page we're on.
Right.
So after we follow them, we're reloading that whole page.
Right. So the advantage is that we're not reloading the whole page.
Whereas in reality, on this whole page, the only thing that we care to change is this. This button is the only piece of information that's going to change and needs to look different than it did before.
Right. Well, and the followers.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. You're going to want to see that updated. So we shouldn't go back to the server and get all this information again.
Right.
Because none of that should change. And that's just very inefficient. And then this starts to get into the way that most of the JavaScript type front-end frameworks work, because a lot of them work on what would be called like a single page app design, where instead of going back and reloading the whole page, they're only ever updating portions of the page as data comes in and re-rendering those portions. They're not going back and getting the whole page again. So Ajax is just it's essentially the way to do that is you can send, stands for, I don't even know if what it stands for matters much anymore, but originally it stood for like asynchronous JavaScript and XML, except it's not used with XML very much anymore. But Ajax is just a way to send something back to the server and have the server respond and send something back to you without forcing the entire page to reload.
And that's so asynchronous, I mean, he uses the word asynchronous in describing. So it's asynchronous in the sense that the different portions, any JavaScript or HTML, and would, I guess, eventually code being rendered as HTML that's being sent, different portions of the page are being rendered asynchronously, like at different times. Is that right?
Yeah, you could call it asynchronous because you can't know when you're going to get back data from the server. So basically what happens is it's a little bit like, say, me going out for milk. My wife's like, hey, Jared, we need to go get some milk. Go get some, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she sends me out. And she doesn't know when I'm going to get back. So we've been doing a lot of Rails programming, Ruby programming that's sequential. It runs right through a set of processes, step by step. And then once it's done with that, it does something like, it serves up the web page, or it does something else. We haven't done very much asynchronous type programming at all because it follows a very different model, and it's a bit hard to reason about compared to the synchronous stuff.
Right. But in a sense, it's more efficient because one thing doesn't wait for the next.
Yeah. So the example with the milk, like if we were talking about that as synchronous, my wife would, let's say she's, I don't know, making omelets or something. She needs some milk, right? She would just, once she said, go pick up some milk, she'd just stop and wait.
Right.
Until that milk shows up, she can't do anything. Right? And asynchronous programming is more like, okay, I've sent out a request and I have something waiting to respond when it gets in. I don't know when that's going to be. I can do everything else I'm doing over here. I'll check back occasionally to see if it's here. And then when it gets in, I'll do something with it. So it's a little more complicated to code for because, like you said, you don't know the order for when things are going to happen. When you're doing just one request like this, that's not a big deal for the most part. It gets more complicated if you have multiple requests going out and you don't know when one's going to come in versus another one, or other situations like that. So you have to end up coding a little bit more flexibly. You can't just code a linear application that goes from beginning to end.
Right.
But it opens up a whole bunch of flexibility here, right? I mean, we've been doing, even making HTTP requests is sort of asynchronous, just not in the same way. You don't control the back end. You don't control when it's going to come back. The only difference is when you're reloading the whole page or you send something for the whole page, that page pretty much isn't doing anything else until that response has come back and it re-renders. In this case, other stuff could be happening on the page while that's going on.
And just so we understand the terminology, so Ajax, what is Ajax is a framework, so it's allowing you to pull in other code, essentially, having written only a small amount of code.
No, I wouldn't describe it as a framework. Ajax is just, maybe a tiny bit of history helps explain it. Ajax, the concept of it was first written into Internet Explorer as a browser. So it's not something that's coming from Rails or Ruby or any other frameworks. It's just a piece of your browser's functionality. And then it's just sort of built into what JavaScript can handle. Because JavaScript always has a little bit of an asynchronous part to it. It's always operated that way with the event loop that it handles. So if you have any event handlers on a web page, other than ones that are just built in, like the default form thing, but if you have something else going on a web page, like when you hover over something, you're going to pop up some dialogues or something like that. That's asynchronous with JavaScript. So all Microsoft did was add in the capability to send something back to a server, and then leave something waiting to find out when that responds and not have to re-render the whole page. So it's just a little bit of a feature tacked into browsers, not a whole framework, more like just a function, really. Closer to just being a function in JavaScript. And then the back end can process those requests the same it could anything else and send back content. And what's going on in the JavaScript side is it's got, the way you're going to write it is you're going to write it as sort of two pieces of code. You're going to write the code that sends off a request, and then you're going to have a function that's called the callback, that when that request comes back, your browser will invoke that callback with the data that comes back from the server and perform some action with that
You
data.
can see the code. Where is it?
Do we have an example of a callback? I don't know if you guys see
Well, maybe
any of it.
maybe it's all just automatically generated.
Yeah, I think it's probably using like jQuery or something, automatically doing some stuff behind the scenes. I can show you. I mean, you can look up a quick reference. Should probably go to the getting started. So there's a whole bunch of complexity. This is why you don't end up wanting to look at all this, but there's a whole bunch of complexity going on behind the scenes with these. And essentially, like I said, it's like a function, but it's just this XML HTTP request. It's an object in JavaScript that you're creating. So you're creating one of these objects and setting some properties on it. And one of the things that you set is this onReady state change.
Okay.
And what you set here, this is where we're doing something that we don't really do a lot of in our Rails. We've done a little bit, but not too much. You set this to a function. You pass a function into this property and set it on it, so that whenever the browser decides that this request that was made, something has happened, something's changed about it, like you sent it, or it's waited, or completed, or an error occurred along those lines. Looks like the four values: uninitialized, loading, loaded, interactive, and complete. Then you're going to get a notice that that's happened, and what it's going to do is it's going to call the function that you set on your onReady state change whenever that happens, and then you'll process. That's your chance to do something with the data that came back, or check it and validate that it's correct, or throw an error if something happened. Like I said, it's a little.
What do you think, guys? We need more details on this?
It's a little confusing when you first start working with it. I mean, it'll be something that you guys will need to know. It's really important to know for web development how this stuff works. So I could probably hunt down a much better example, because it's a little hard to explain the concept.
Well, we're all torn right now between not wanting to know anything and wanting to know more. Yeah. So well, I think it'll be interesting. Presumably, if everybody's working on projects, I imagine someone might run into something where it seems like the sort of thing where you won't necessarily have to get into this, but in order to do something exactly the way you want to, maybe it would be helpful.
Right. Another way to think of it, Ajax, is that we've been relying on the browser to send everything back to the server whenever any request is made with our forms or anything. We've let the browser handle that. So the browser has its own logic built into it to say, here's what happens when somebody clicks a form button. I know where to look for this information. I know what to send based off the information that's in this form, including those hidden fields that pass the IDs. And then when I get a response back from the server, oh, okay, here's what I know to do with that. I got a response back, then I need to render that page that I just got back. I need to put everything on the screen. I need to put it exactly where it needs to go and render the HTML and the CSS. And when you're working with Ajax instead, you are sort of bypassing the browser doing all of that work for you. So inside of your Ajax work, now the browser, in a sense, no longer knows, oh, what do I need to send when this button's clicked if you're processing with Ajax. Now, luckily, Rails has some nice wrappers to make this stuff work really nice. I'm assuming it uses, like I said, probably creates a jQuery Ajax wrapper of some kind, something along those lines to send back. We could probably look at the HTML if you have it. Do you have that working, the Ajax portion? And do that. But what's going on is once that's been sent, the browser still handles stuff, but it handles it at a lower level. It doesn't actually handle processing what it gets back. It just handles telling your Ajax function, hey, something came back. You need to do something with that because you've decided you want to control that instead of letting me control everything. And so then you have to write the code that processes what's going on when that data comes back. Right. Did we create these format.html? Well, let me see.
Yeah, there's. We had to create the .erb or .js.erb files. Is that what you're looking for?
No. Oh yeah, I see.
Yeah, so those are the files that's the level of specificity that you get to in the app itself, or in what we code.
Right. Yeah, I get that. Yep, so there's a lot of cool magic going on there because this file is both being processed. In a sense, this file is being processed on the server and on the client. And we've been doing that with our ERB files as well, like our HTML ones, where the server, the Ruby, embedded Ruby in it, does something to create some HTML, and then we send this HTML up to the browser to run, right, or to render. This is working a little bit differently, where this portion of the embedded Ruby in this JavaScript file is being processed on the create and injecting, instead of sending back an HTML file, it's sending back this JavaScript code, but this JavaScript code where instead of the string being this, it's been replaced with whatever the Ruby determined was the correct option for that. So in other words, we've got those two templates up above, the follow and unfollow templates, and so it's rendering those into, or rendering those views or partial views into this. And then when it hits the browser is going to run the JavaScript code that exists in this create.js, which now by the time it's come back to it is going to have real HTML in it. And that JavaScript code is going to find the element on the page with the ID follow form and replace the HTML in it with the contents from this. And it's going to find the ID element on the page with the ID followers and replace the content.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you had that portion working,
I think so.
that would be great to see.
This is just some of the dummy data that's seeded in here.
Oh, that's fun.
What should I do?
So let's go over to the network tab on the developer tools that you have up. Okay, they're clear, perfect. Then click the unfollow button. All right, now let's click on that one that came back, and we're going to look at the details from this and talk through a little bit of that. We can make it larger. We really don't even need to see the sample app, so you can even make it most of the screen.
Look how responsive it is.
That is pretty cool.
I did that all myself.
And zooming works the same way on your command plus, I think. We want to make it larger. Oh, nice. So what you can see here is it looked a lot like what you had in the create.js.erb, just like what we've done with these HTML ERBs, except inside of the HTML, instead of any of the Ruby stuff, we actually have just raw HTML as a string that we returned back. So that was what was processed on the Ruby side, was it went and rendered this partial into that string. And then once this comes back to the browser, it's going to go ahead and respond to this request that came back. If you click the X, so we get rid of out of these details on this item, I think. Let me see here. This will work. All right. Now hover over the jQuery, the initiator bit. Yeah. So send. Let's go up to that. Let's click on that request. I don't know if this will work or not. It might be minified. So this was the code that actually made the request. It's the JavaScript coming from jQuery that's wrapped all of this and then is processing what to do when the request comes back and running the JavaScript that came back as well. So it makes this send. The options.data, I believe, is probably where, oh no, I think we have it right below the callback type code. So I think this callback code here is where it's deciding what to do with what you got back from the response. This is stuff that we don't really need to know because it's inside of jQuery, and Rails is wrapping some of this, so it's sort of nice that we don't have to get down into the details of what's going on here. As you could see before, when I was trying to show you raw Ajax calls, they're pretty ugly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that makes them not pretty to work with. I don't know if that just helped or it just made everything muddier, but
I think it was the good sort of muddy that eventually will lead to clarity.
It's a tough concept to pick up when you start working with these asynchronous requests and you start working with asynchronous code. It's not instantaneous, I understand.
Sound good? How much time we have? We've only got like 10 minutes. I had one other sort of short but fundamental question. If you look at listing 12.39, this is just test code here, and the thing that made me a little confused was if you look at some of the lower tests that we're adding, should follow a user, the standard way should follow a user. All the last four tests, I believe, we use a post request or post action, which is post request, to the relationships underscore path, which I would guess some of you guys maybe understand this better. Just made me realize I didn't understand. I still have trouble understanding what the paths are. Underscore path. Like, is it the best I can do? Does that essentially just mean we're pointing you to the relationships controller?
I think it's sort of what that means. It's what's going on is it's making an actual HTTP call, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to make that HTTP call, say on the post, it needs to know the URL that it's making the call to. So this is just the URL. Why can't I ever do that when I want to? I love it when my mouse gets huge. This is just the URL that it needs to make the post request to.
Okay, that's what I thought, because I thought the path had to do with the URL.
Yeah.
But do we ever
Declare the relationships path.
Yeah, is there ever a time when we see, like, does that you ever show up in our browser in the web address? Something / relationship something?
No, I don't think that one ever shows up as a web address, but it does show up as the I don't know how much higher I need to go than this. 3.2. It does show up as the. I know I need to go up. It does happen to be, I believe, the. I'll have to look, but it's going to be the address that you send to when you follow or unfollow someone, I believe, because you're going to the relationships controller at that point, and the relationships controller is going to be mapped there. So we never actually render a relationships page directly, right? But we are using it to issue post and delete requests to.
Right.
And so that's why you never see it per se, but it exists and is being used. It's just part of more the API, more the back end, what you call to, than what the user ends up seeing.
Okay. Yeah, I just realized that is one portion of the test that I would, among others, that I would struggle with is thinking about which path I would need to indicate for various things.
Right. I mean, that comes back to it just mapping again back to your objects. So you've got this relationships controller that you can create and delete from. So if you're trying to test the relationships controller and you're trying to test a create action on it, then doing a post to the relationships path would be the way to test the create action on the relationships controller. Not necessarily create action, you could name it something different, but we're using the convention, right?
Right.
Is because of the way Ruby does the mapping, or Rails does the mapping. So relationships path is just something sort of generated by Rails as its own variable to send you to that correct route for that controller.
Okay.
I think I have the answer, by the way, to your earlier question on the Ajax and why we needed to switch to the @ syntax here. The reason is because if you're using the local variables like user, those are only going to exist within the context of this function, in a sense, right? They're not going to exist externally. But when we down here, we created these like create.js.erb and destroy, we're referencing information about the user now.
Oh, okay.
And this is while it's set up here in this respond to, it's not going to exist and be generated in this exact same context. It's not going to inherit the full context of this method and all of the local properties to that method, but it does, because of the way Rails works, it does inherit. It is in the context of the object. So in that case, it is in the same context as this relationships controller object. So anything that we've created that are properties on it, like this add user, exist and can be referenced in this ERB, this embedded Ruby. But if we tried that without it, which if you want to test, you could do really easily. If we tried it without it, it would probably fail to set to find what it's looking for here and fail to set the HTML because a user wouldn't exist at that point in time.
Right. Okay.
Because it's not in the right context.
Everybody's nodding. Everybody's like,
That one's
makes sense.
a little, I mean, yeah, it's a little tricky to remember the difference between when something is a property on the object versus when it's local, and then where Rails allows you to reference those as well. Because it's not necessarily obvious why inside of this ERB file I should be able to reference that.
Right. I agree, it's tricky.
That property.
Cynthia agrees, it's tricky. Cynthia's totally off screen. She's over there hiding.
Now she even scooted farther away. Like
Yeah.
we're gonna go up there and grab the camera and turn it to face her.
All right. Any other questions? This is the grand finale. Now's the time. I think we're at the limit. So who's gonna actually? I've seen on Stack Overflow that there are some questions. I don't know if anyone else has seen this, where people have questions because they've built the whole app through the Hurdle tutorial, and then they've decided to just keep going with it and modify it and make it into something more unique to them. You guys all gonna do that?
That would be cool.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
Yeah. We can just at least like turn the screen green or something. Okay, well, if you do that, share it on Slack so we can see your production version.
Right. Or if you get done, or you're stuck on anything.
Yep. All right. That's it. We're done. Yes. Okay, we're done.